Good afternoon. In this study, we're going to look at Genesis chapters 10 and 11. Chapter 10 continues the genealogies which we have seen in chapters 4 and 5, as Moses continues the human family tree, bringing us down to Abraham's day. The major point we draw from this chapter is that all of the human race is related. We all descend from Noah through one of his three sons. We also see God's command to Noah to be fruitful and multiply being fulfilled through his sons, chapter 9, verses 1 and 7. To use a modern analogy, chapter 10 makes us think of the United Nations. In fact, it is often referred to as the Table of Nations. We will refrain from persistently saying we don't know who these people are, or this person might be the ancestor of such and such, or perhaps even such and such. What is most relevant for our purposes is to see that the various nations with whom Israel had contact, either in friendly ways or antagonistic ways throughout biblical history, are all related to Israel. Speaking in general, the family of Japheth migrates north and west of Canaan, the future land of Israel. Ham's family migrates toward the Nile River in one direction and the Euphrates River in the other direction. The family of Shem, the family from whom comes Abraham, stretches from the Iranian mountains into northern Mesopotamia, Syria, and into the Arabian Peninsula. Let's read chapter 10, verses 1 through 5. Now these are the generations of the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Then there was born to them sons after the flood. The sons of Japheth were Gomer, and Magog, and Madai, and Javan, and Tubal, and Meshech, and Tiras. And the sons of Gomer were Ashkenaz, and Riphath, and Togarmah. And the sons of Javan were Elishah, and Tarshish, Kittim, and Dodanim. From these were spread the islands of the nations into their lands, a man according to his language, according to their families, into their nations. This paragraph is the family of Japheth. Moses begins with Japheth, the nations which had the least contact with Israel, the furthest from the land of Israel. Moses also only gives grandsons through only two of Japheth's sons. Magog is found again in Ezekiel chapters 38 and 39, although we do not know which nation it is, nor whom Gog, its king, might be. Madai are the Medes. Javan will eventually refer to the Greeks. Togarmah exported horses to Tyre. Ashkenaz will be called the Scythians by the Greeks. The Scythians inhabited the area of modern southern Russia. Tarshish, in verse 4, was heavily involved in trade and commerce, and is most widely known from the story of Jonah. And yet we do not know if it was in the area of Carthage, North Africa, or in Spain, which are the two most widely suggested locations. Kittim was a Phoenician city on the island of Cyprus. Dodanim, or Rodanim, apparently an alternative spelling, refers to the island of Rhodes in the Aegean Sea. All the nations have their own, unofficial at least, borders, their own languages, and their own lifestyle. Largely, these nations have migrated northeast and northwest of Israel. They also have the least amount of contact with Israel during the biblical period. Paul mentions the Scythians in Colossians chapter 3, verse 11. Some scholars suggest the nations assembled on the day of Pentecost are intended to reflect this table of nations. While the nations themselves are not the same, we believe theologically the events of Pentecost undid the division of the nations caused at the Tower of Babel in chapter 11. Let's study chapter 10, verses 6 through 20. Now the sons of Ham were Cush, and Mizrahim, and Put, and Canaan. And the sons of Cush, Seba, and Havilah, and Sabtah, and Raamah, and Sabtekah, and the sons of Raamah were Sheba and Dedan. And Cush bore Nimrod. He began to be a warrior on the earth. He was a warrior of game before Jehovah, so that it was said, like Nimrod, a warrior of game before Jehovah. And it was the beginning of his kingdom of Babel, and Erech, and Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. From that land he went out to Ashur, and he built Nineveh, and Rehoboth-ur, and Calah, and Resen between Nineveh and Calah. This was the great city. And Mizraim bore Ludim, and Anamim, and Lechabim, and Naphtuhim, and Pathrusim, and Kasluhim, from which went out from Philistine and Caphtorim. And Canaan bore Sidon his firstborn and Heth, and the Jebusites, and the Amorites, and the Girgashites, and Hivites, and Markites, and Sinites, and Arvadites, and Zemarites, and Hamathites, and afterwards there were scattered from the clans of the Canaanites. Now the boundary of the Canaanites was from Sidon to go toward Gerar until Gaza, to go toward Sodom and Gomorrah and Admah and Zeboim until Lasha. These are the sons of Ham, according to their families, according to their languages, in their land of their nations. Nimrod is said to be a warrior, which is a related word with the word translated to prevail in chapter 7, relative to the waters of the flood. It can also refer to a man in general, but emphasizing a male at the height of his physical strength. The word kingdom is a widely used word in the Old Testament, since Israel will form a kingdom and then serve as a picture of the kingdom of the Messiah, the Church of Christ. The whole word family, which includes to reign and king and queen, is found well over 3,000 times. The second paragraph here records the family of Ham. These nations will frequently be the antagonists of Israel throughout Old Testament history. The length of the section indicates its importance. Also, the references to these men or nations will be more frequent through the Old Testament than the sons of Japheth. Cush is identified with northeast Africa, usually Ethiopia or modern Sudan. Mizrahim is a Hebrew word for Egypt, and it's a dual word, conveying the idea of a plurality, suggesting Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. Canaan, or Canaan, is the land that will be promised to Abraham and his family, Israel, and we'll make many references to that. The nations in verse 7 apparently were located in southern Arabia. Havilah was mentioned in the description of the Garden of Eden in chapter 2, verse 11, where gold was located. It is also the area where Ishmael will migrate. Sheba was also known for trade, especially in Solomon's time. It is located in modern-day Yemen. Nimrod certainly cannot be identified with any other known figure from ancient history. Micah chapter 5 verse 6 identifies Assyria as the land of Nimrod. He established some cities which became large and influential. Babel, which is southeast of modern Baghdad, Erech, 100 miles further south than Babel, a city of Sumer, and Akkad, at one time a capital of Assyria, which gave its name to the Semitic language, Akkadian. The expression before the Lord might easily mean that he had God's approval for his hunting. It could also mean he was the greatest. The phrase before the Lord suggesting the superlative. Asher refers to both the nation of Assyria and a city in Assyria. Nineveh, once a capital of Assyria, is also known from Jonah's day. Its founding is dated around 4500 BC, making it one of the oldest cities. Modern-day Mosul lies across the Tigris River from ancient Nineveh. It was destroyed by the Medes and the Babylonians in 612 BC. Calah was once a capital of Assyria as well. The names in verses 13 and 14 have the Hebrew masculine plural ending, which identifies them as ethnicities. Sidon, verse 15, was a Phoenician city on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. Heth refers to the Hittites. The Jebusites, in verse 16, established the city that would later be called Jerusalem. The Amorites, Girgashites, are listed among the nations in Canaan, which Israel was to exterminate because of their idolatry and immorality. The same is true of the Hivites in verse 17. The Amorites were the group which gave us the tablets found at Mari. Og and Sion are Amorites. The Arvadites lived in the city of Phoenicia, which was associated with Tyre. Hamath served Kings David and Solomon. It was also later conquered by King Jeroboam II. Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, and Zeboim were located south of the Dead Sea and will play a prominent role in Genesis chapter 19. Gerar will also be prominent in Genesis chapters 20, 21, and 26. An Ethiopian from Cush will become a Christian in Acts chapter 8, verses 26 through 40. Babel is not found in the New Testament, but Babylon is found a dozen times. And it places a central role as a symbol of the nation of Rome in the book of Revelation. Let's read verses 21 through 32. And to Shem was born also, he was the father of all the sons of Eber, the brother of Japheth, the oldest. The sons of Shem were Elam, and Asher, and Arpachshad, and Lud, and Aram. And the sons of Aram were Uz, and Hul, and Gaither, and Mash. And Arpachshad bore Shelah, and Shelah bore Eber. And to Eber was born two sons. The name of the first Peleg, because in his days was divided the earth, and the name of his brother was Joktan. And Joktan gave birth to Almodad, and Sheleph, and Hazarmaveth, and Jirah, and Hadoram, and Uzal, and Diklah, and Obal, and Abimiel, and Sheba, and Ophir, and Havilah, and Jubab. All these were sons of Joktan. And it was their territory from Mesha to go towards Sepharah, the mountain of the east. These were the sons of Shem according to their families, according to their languages, in their land, according to their nations. These were the clans of the sons of Noah, according to their genealogies in their nations, and from these were scattered the nations in the earth after the flood. This final list is that of Shem, listed last because he's the ancestor of Abraham, who will be the focus of chapters 11 and 12. Elam was east and northeast of the Euphrates and Mesopotamia. Susa was its capital. Asher was the capital of Assyria. There was apparently another Asher in northern Sinai. Aram is the ancestor of the Aramaeans, or Syria, as modern translations translate it. Its capital was Damascus, and Aramaic became the common language of the Jews following the exile in Babylon, and was probably the language spoken by Jesus and his contemporaries. This Uz in verse 23 does not seem to be the home of the patriarch Job, since his Uz is likely closer to Edom, southeast of Israel. In verse 24, Eber is the ancestor of the Hebrews. It was in Peleg's day, verse 25, that the earth was divided. The easiest interpretation of that refers to the division following the incident at the Tower of Babel that we'll study in just a moment in chapter 11. Otherwise, the division could refer to any number of possibilities, such as an earthquake, or the division of the single continent into the 7 continents that we know of today. Ophir was noted for its gold. King Solomon had commerce with Ophir. All these nations are related to Israel. There's one God and one humanity. There was nothing special about Israel. God will call Abram and send the Messiah through his family simply out of God's gracious plans to save all these nations from their sins. God will later tell Israel, "You only have I chosen among all the families of the earth, therefore I will punish you for all your iniquities." Amos 3 verse 2. It has been frequently pointed out that if one excludes the warrior Nimrod, then there are 70 nations, or progenitors of nations, listed here. Perhaps Jesus chose 70 disciples in Luke chapter 10 verse 1 to call people to him as a reflection of this table of 70 nations. Shem's family, of course, are in the line of Jesus Christ, which is given in Luke chapter 3 verse 35. Now let's study chapter 11. The Tower of Babel is a story of the dispersal of humanity along with the confusion of languages. While most scholars picture this tower as a ziggurat, there is no known parallel to this story among the ancient Near Eastern peoples. We are not compelled to visualize this tower as a ziggurat. It might have just been a defense tower like we see in Judges chapter 8 verse 9 and chapter 9 verse 46. The word, which I am going to translate as a great building, is used 45 times throughout the Old Testament. God has been clear that he wanted man to multiply and spread across the earth, chapter 1 verse 28 and chapter 9 verses 1 and 7. Man had refused to obey God's command to fill the earth. We do not know much about the ancient history of Babylon, one of the oldest nations in man's history. The Euphrates River has shifted over time and buried lower levels. There is no significant information about Babylon until it becomes the capital of the empire, which bears its name in the 18th century BC. Let's read chapter 11, verses 1 through 9. It happened all the earth had one language and united words. Language here is the word lip, which is its most frequent use. but it also refers to a language spoken with the lips or the edge of the seashore. What I have translated united words actually translates two words, the plural of the word one, with the word word. It conveys the idea of vocabulary. Verse 2, it happened when they journeyed toward the east that they found a valley of the land of Shinar, and they settled there. And they said a man to his neighbor, Come, let us make bricks, and let us burn them thoroughly. Let us make bricks is a related word to the noun bricks. In other words, the people say literally, let us brick bricks. The verb let us burn them is also followed by the same verb in an infinitive construction, so the people were emphatic. Let us burn them thoroughly. And there was to them brick for stone, and tar was for them for mortar. Verse 4, they said, Come, let us build for ourselves a city and a large building, and its top to the heavens, and let us make for ourselves a name, lest we scatter on the face of all the earth. Jehovah came down to see the city and the large building which they built, the sons of men. Then Jehovah said, Behold, one people they are, and one language for all of them, and this is the beginning to make, and now it is not impossible for them anything which they plan to do. Come, let us go down, and let us confuse their language, which they do not hear, a man the language of his neighbor. So Jehovah scattered them from there on the face of all the earth, and they stopped building the city. Therefore its name is called Babel, since there Jehovah confused the language of all the earth, and from there Jehovah scattered them on the face of all the earth. Shinar is the land of Mesopotamia, which was first called Sumer, then Sumer and Akkad, and finally Babylonia. Moses shows a quite accurate and detailed knowledge of construction techniques of Mesopotamian culture. Bitumen was used for mortar. It adds strength and cohesion to the bricks. Bitumen was found early in man's history in Mesopotamia. Stones were used for such building projects in Canaan. Babylon will not appear again in Genesis or the Pentateuch as a whole. Ur of the Chaldeans, which is south of Babylon, is the home of Tira and his family that we'll read about at the end of this chapter. God had intended the human population to be fruitful and multiply and spread over the earth. Man wanted to stay in one place and make a reputation or a name for himself. Moses begins this account by stating the unity of language and communication which mankind had, and that sets up the scene for the people to unite their strengths and skills to build this great building or tower. The people journeyed east, indicating a further move from the presence of God. See chapter 3 verse 24 and chapter 4 verse 16. And they came to the infamous land of Babylonia, Shinar. And there this people began making kiln-fired bricks and adding mortar to it. The first thing they decide they want to build is a city, and then they want to build a large building, or better known as a tower, the Tower of Babel. There were really two goals in their building project. Number one, they wanted to make a name or a reputation for themselves, and number two, they were rebelling against God's command to scatter. Israel understood that God sits above the earth, Isaiah 40 verse 22. So that for God to come down to see man illustrates the weakness of man's ability to reach heaven. The whole incident makes a mockery of man's pride. The Old Testament is also consistent in teaching that God is omniscient, so he does not have to literally come down to see what man is doing. But God saw the power of their unity, the power of their united language. If God were to let them go, they would fall into the same cesspool of violence and sin and corruption as the pre-flood world. So God decided to confuse their language so that they could no longer communicate in building their great building. Once God confused their language, they eventually scattered, fulfilling reluctantly the command of God to fill the earth. It seems that the building of the city to stay in one place was the heart of their rebellion against God. Moses then highlights the shame of the people, saying the land was called Babel, since God confused Balal, their language. So Jehovah God scattered the people. There are two references to God scattering the people. Again, their sin was refusing to fill the earth. God forced them to scatter by confusing their languages. They had intended to make a name for themselves. Instead, God caused them to be known for their shame. God will take his own initiative to make Abraham a great name. The sin of the Babylonians was in refusing to fill the earth as God had commanded back in chapter 9 and verse 7. The great building unfinished became testimony to all those who remained in the vicinity that they should obey God's command. Darkness and confusion will result when one refuses to listen and to obey God's word. Coming out of Egypt, the Israelites needed constant reminders that idolatry would be punished. They needed to be warned that making a name for yourself, especially if it meant violating God's commandments, was a dead-end street. The Tower of Babel would teach them that lesson. But would they listen? Let's read chapter 11, verses 10 through 32. These are the generations of Shem. Shem was the son of 100 years. And there was born Arpachshad 2 years after the flood. Shem lived after was born Arpachshad 500 years, and there was born sons and daughters. Then Arpachshad lived 35 years, and there was born Shelah. And Arpachshad lived after was born Shelah 403 years, and there was born sons and daughters. Then Shelah lived 30 years, and there was born Eber. Shelah lived after there was born Eber 430 years, and there was born sons and daughters. Then Eber lived 34 years, and there was born Peleg. Eber lived after was born Peleg 430 years, and there was born sons and daughters. Then Peleg lived 30 years, and there was born Reu. And Peleg lived after he was born Reu 209 years, and there was born sons and daughters. Then Reu lived 32 years, and there was born Serug. And Reu lived after was born Serug 207 years, and there was born sons and daughters. Then Serug lived 30 years, and was born Nahor. And Serug lived after was born Nahor 200 years, and there was born sons and daughters. Then Nahor lived 39 years, and was born Tira. And Nahor lived after was born Tira 119 years, and there was born sons and daughters. Then Tira lived 70 years, and there was born Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Now these are the generations of Tira. Tira fathered Abram, Nahor, and Haran fathered Lot. Then Haran died before Tira his father in the land of his birth, in Ur of the Chaldeans. Then Abram took and Nahor to them 2 wives. The wife of Abram was Sarai, and the name of the wife of Nahor was Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah, and the father of Iscah. Now Sarai was barren. There was not to her a child. Then Tira took Abram his son, and Lot the son of Haran, the son of his son, and Sarai his daughter-in-law, the wife of Abram his son, and they went out with them from Ur of Chaldeans to go to the land of Canaan. And they came as far as Haran, and they dwelt there. The days of Tira were 205 years, and Tira died in Haran. The Chaldeans were an ethnic group related to the Aramaeans. The Chaldeans are found 73 times in the Bible, prominently in Jeremiah. Ur of the Chaldeans appears 4 times in the Old Testament. Haran, the city, is spelled differently in Hebrew than the man's name. It was located about 550 miles northwest of Ur in modern Turkey. Haran was about halfway between Ur to the land of Canaan. Verse 10 will be the last mention of the flood in the book of Genesis, leaving that tragedy and the antediluvian world behind. Verse 10 also denotes one of the divisions of Genesis marked off by the phrase, "These are the generations." Verse 10 begins the division relative to Shem's family. Verse 27 will use the same phrase denoting the division relative to Tira's family. There is some similarity between the name of Tira and the Hebrew word for moon. Sarai is related to the Akkadian name for the female partner of the moon god. Milcah is a name for the daughter of the moon god. Both Ur and Haran were centers of moon worship. We know that Abram comes out of a city which was well known and focused on worship of the moon. We are informed in Joshua 24 and verse 2 that Abram came from an idolatrous family and community. Abraham seems to have been a popular name in the 2nd and 1st millennia BC. God will call Abram to leave Ur of Chaldea before he called him to leave Haran. Remember that Abram lived in a society that was engulfed in idolatry and in a family which worshipped idols. Now idols neither see nor hear nor talk. So for God to speak to Abram out of the blue would test Abram's faith, calling him to follow a God whom he could not see. Notice in verse 30 that Sarai's barrenness is emphasized. In 2 ways Moses notes that she did not have children. She could not have children. And that sets the stage for God's powerful, unbelievable promise to Abram coming up in chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. God will work in the lives of barren women several times through Old Testament history. Rebekah, Rachel, Mrs. Manoah, Hannah, and Elizabeth, in order to prepare the hearts and minds of the Jews for the unique virgin birth of Jesus Christ himself. Next week, we'll take a look at chapter 12 and see how God separates Abram from his idolatrous family. Thank you for joining me in our study, and God be with you.